Princess Kathryn walked quietly through the marble halls of the royal palace, her silk slippers making no sound on the polished floors. The morning sun streamed through tall windows, casting golden light across ancient tapestries that told stories of her family's long reign. She had always loved this peaceful time before the palace fully awakened, when she could move freely without the constant attention of guards and servants. Today felt different somehow. There was a tension in the air that made her pause outside the East Wing, where her younger brother, Prince Alexander, lived with his governess, Lady Larissa. At 15, Kathryn was old enough to notice things that others might miss, and lately, she had been noticing quite a lot about how her 8-year-old brother was being treated. The first sign that something was wrong had come 3 weeks ago during the royal family's weekly dinner. Alexander, usually bright and talkative, had barely spoken a word. When their father, King Edmund, asked about his studies, the young prince had flinched as if expecting to be struck. Lady Larissa, sitting nearby, had quickly answered for him, explaining that the prince was simply tired from his lessons. Kathryn remembered how her brother's eyes had darted nervously to his governess before looking down at his untouched plate. She had tried to catch his attention, to offer him an encouraging smile, but Alexander seemed afraid to even look at anyone directly. When dessert was served, his favorite chocolate cake, he had asked permission from Lady Larissa before taking even a small bite. The second incident occurred during archery practice in the royal gardens. Kathryn had been practicing her own skills with the bow when she heard shouting from the children's training area. Hiding behind a large oak tree, she watched as Lady Larissa berated Alexander for missing the target. The governess's voice was sharp and cruel, calling him worthless and stupid, words that no child should ever hear, especially not a prince who was still learning. What shocked Kathryn most was seeing Lady Larissa grab Alexander's arm roughly, leaving red marks on his pale skin. When the young prince stumbled, clearly overwhelmed by the harsh treatment, Lady Larissa had threatened to tell the king that Alexander was being deliberately disobedient. The fear in her brother's eyes was something Kathryn would never forget. Since then, she had been watching more carefully, and what she discovered made her stomach turn with anger and worry. Alexander had lost weight, his clothes hanging loose on his small frame. Dark circles shadowed his eyes, suggesting he wasn't sleeping well. Most concerning of all, he had stopped laughing, stopped playing, stopped being the joyful child he had always been. Lady Larissa Pemberton had come to the palace with excellent references from noble families across the kingdom. She was said to be strict but fair, exactly what the royal family wanted for their younger son's education. The woman was in her 40s, tall and stern-looking, with graying hair always pulled back severely. She spoke multiple languages, was well-versed in history and mathematics, and knew all the proper protocols for raising a future member of the royal family. What the references hadn't mentioned was her cruel nature and her belief that children needed to be broken down completely before they could be built up properly. Lady Larissa saw Alexander's natural curiosity and gentle spirit as weaknesses that needed to be eliminated. She had convinced herself that by being harsh and demanding, she was preparing him for the difficult life of royalty. The governess had also grown jealous of the attention Alexander received from other palace staff. The servants adored the young prince's kind nature and ready smile, something that irritated Lady Larissa immensely. She began isolating him from the friendly cooks who would sneak him treats, the stable boys who taught him about horses, and even from his own sister. During their private lessons, Lady Larissa would criticize everything Alexander did. His handwriting was too messy, his posture too relaxed, his questions too frequent. When he struggled with difficult concepts, she would tell him he was disappointing his family and would never be worthy of his royal title. The psychological pressure was crushing the spirit of a child who had once been full of life and wonder. Kathryn decided she needed concrete evidence before approaching her parents. She knew that Lady Larissa was careful around other adults, presenting a polite and professional face whenever the king or queen visited. The governess was clever enough to save her worst behavior for when she and Alexander were completely alone. The princess began finding excuses to walk past Alexander's study room during his lessons. She would pause to tie her shoe or stop to admire a painting, anything that would allow her to listen to what was happening inside. What she heard broke her heart. Lady Larissa's voice was constantly critical, never offering a word of encouragement or praise, no matter how hard Alexander tried. One afternoon, Kathryn heard her brother quietly crying during what was supposed to be reading time. When she peeked through the slightly open door, she saw Lady Larissa forcing Alexander to stand in the corner facing the wall, his small shoulders shaking with silent sobs. The governess sat calmly at her desk, acting as if the suffering child didn't exist. That evening, Kathryn tried to talk to Alexander when she found him alone in the library. He was sitting in the window seat, staring out at the gardens with a sadness that seemed far too heavy for someone so young. When she approached, he immediately straightened up and tried to smile, but his eyes remained frightened. She asked how his lessons were going, and Alexander gave the same rehearsed answers she had been hearing for weeks. Everything was fine. Lady Larissa was an excellent teacher. He was learning so much. But his voice was flat and emotionless, completely unlike the enthusiastic chatter she remembered from before. When Kathryn gently asked if he was happy, Alexander's composure cracked for just a moment. She saw raw pain flash across his young face before he quickly looked away and mumbled that of course he was happy. It was clear that he had been warned against complaining or telling anyone about his treatment. The princess realized that her brother was trapped in a situation he couldn't escape from alone. Lady Larissa had successfully isolated him and convinced him that this treatment was normal, perhaps even deserved. Alexander's natural trust and desire to please adults were being used against him, making him the perfect victim for someone who enjoyed having power over others. As Kathryn left the library that night, her mind was made up. She couldn't stand by and watch her beloved brother suffer in silence any longer. Lady Larissa's reign of cruelty was going to end, but first she needed proof that even the most protective parents couldn't ignore. The princess began planning how she would gather the evidence needed to save Alexander from the woman who was destroying his childhood one cruel word at a time. Princess Kathryn knew she needed to be extremely careful in gathering evidence against Lady Larissa. The governess was cunning and would certainly become suspicious if she noticed the princess paying too much attention to Alexander's lessons. Kathryn decided to use her knowledge of the palace's secret passages, hidden doorways that had been built centuries ago for the royal family's protection during times of war. Behind Alexander's study room was an old servants' corridor that hadn't been used in decades. Kathryn discovered that by removing a loose stone in the wall, she could see and hear everything happening in the room without being detected. The space was cramped and dusty, but it gave her the perfect vantage point to witness Lady Larissa's true behavior when she thought no one was watching. What Kathryn observed over the next several days was worse than she had imagined. Lady Larissa wasn't just strict or demanding. She was deliberately cruel. When Alexander made small mistakes in his mathematics, the governess would force him to solve problems while standing on one foot, causing him to fall repeatedly. She would then berate him for his clumsiness and make him start over. During writing lessons, Lady Larissa would examine Alexander's work with a magnifying glass, finding tiny flaws that she would declare unacceptable. She would then tear up his carefully written pages and force him to begin again, often making him work late into the evening while missing dinner. When his stomach would rumble from hunger, she would scold him for being distracted and add extra assignments as punishment. The governess had also begun using Alexander's love for his family against him. She would tell him that his poor performance was bringing shame to the royal name, that his parents were disappointed in him, and that his sister was embarrassed by his failures. These lies cut deep into the young prince's heart, making him withdraw further from the people who truly cared about him. Kathryn watched in horror as Lady Larissa discovered Alexander's fear of enclosed spaces, a mild anxiety he had developed after getting trapped in a wardrobe during a childhood game of hide-and-seek. The cruel governess began using this fear as a punishment, forcing him to sit in a small storage closet whenever she deemed his behavior unacceptable. Alexander would emerge pale and shaking, but too frightened to complain or resist. The psychological torture was having a visible effect on the young prince. His hands had developed a slight tremor from constant stress, making his handwriting even more difficult and giving Lady Larissa more reasons to criticize him. He had begun stuttering when nervous, which happened frequently now. Dark bruises appeared on his arms where the governess would grab him roughly when he moved too slowly or didn't pay attention. One particularly awful afternoon, Kathryn watched as Lady Larissa forced Alexander to throw away his favorite toy, a small wooden horse that had been a gift from their grandfather before his death. She claimed that 8-year-old princes were too old for such childish things, and that keeping toys showed weakness of character. Alexander's silent tears, as he placed his treasured horse in the wastebasket, nearly made Kathryn cry out from her hiding place. The princess began keeping detailed notes of everything she witnessed, recording dates, times, and exact descriptions of Lady Larissa's actions. She wrote about the verbal abuse, the physical rough treatment, the deliberate deprivation of food and sleep, and the psychological manipulation designed to break Alexander's spirit. The evidence was damning, but Kathryn knew she needed more than just her word against that of a respected governess. Her opportunity came when she overheard Lady Larissa speaking with her personal maid, Martha, who helped with Alexander's daily care. Martha had worked for Lady Larissa for many years and was clearly uncomfortable with what she was witnessing. The maid tried to suggest gentler approaches to the prince's education, but Lady Larissa snapped at her, making it clear that questioning her methods would result in immediate dismissal. Kathryn realized that Martha might be willing to speak up if she knew she would have protection from retaliation. The princess approached the maid carefully, finding her alone in the servants' quarters one evening. Martha's eyes filled with tears the moment Kathryn mentioned her concerns about Alexander, confirming that the woman had been struggling with what she had seen. Martha revealed that Lady Larissa had threatened all the servants who worked in Alexander's wing, warning them that anyone who spoke against her would be dismissed without references. She had created an atmosphere of fear that kept good people from protecting the young prince. The maid also shared disturbing details about Alexander's private moments, how he would cry himself to sleep and sometimes wake up screaming from nightmares. The servant told Kathryn about finding Alexander hiding in the bathroom, too afraid to come out because he had accidentally spilled ink on his lesson papers. Martha had discovered him there hours later, hungry and exhausted, but still too terrified of Lady Larissa's reaction to return to the study. The maid had cleaned up the ink and helped create new papers, but Alexander had made her promise not to tell anyone, fearing that the governess would find an even worse punishment. With Martha's testimony and her own detailed observations, Kathryn felt she had enough evidence to present to her parents. However, she decided to make one final attempt to gather proof that would be absolutely undeniable. She convinced the palace's chief librarian, an elderly man named Master Geoffrey, who had taught her to read, to lend her a small recording device that scholars sometimes use to preserve important lectures. Hidden in her secret viewing spot, Kathryn managed to record several of Lady Larissa's cruel sessions with Alexander. The recordings captured the governess's harsh words, Alexander's quiet pleas for mercy, and the sounds of the physical punishments. The evidence was heartbreaking, but necessary to ensure that Lady Larissa could never convince anyone that her treatment of the prince was appropriate or exaggerated. As she prepared to approach her parents, Kathryn made one final check on her brother. She found Alexander in his bedroom, sitting on the floor by his window, looking thinner and sadder than ever. His eyes had lost their sparkle completely, replaced by a dull acceptance of his daily suffering. When she asked if he was well, he gave her the same empty reassurances she had been hearing for weeks. That night, Kathryn lay awake, planning exactly how she would present the evidence to her parents. She knew that Lady Larissa's reputation and credentials would make her parents initially skeptical of such serious accusations. The governess had been careful to maintain her professional image around the king and queen, always appearing devoted to Alexander's education and well-being. The princess also worried about how the scandal would affect Alexander. He would need time to heal from the psychological damage inflicted by Lady Larissa, and he would require gentle care to rebuild his confidence and trust. Kathryn was determined to be part of that healing process, to help her brother remember how to laugh and play and simply be a child again. Tomorrow, she would request a private audience with their parents. Armed with her notes, Martha's testimony, and the recorded evidence, she would expose Lady Larissa's cruelty and demand justice for Alexander. The governess's days of tormenting the young prince were numbered, and Kathryn felt a fierce satisfaction knowing that she was about to bring this nightmare to an end. Princess Kathryn requested an urgent private meeting with her parents the following morning, asking to speak with them in the king's private study where they wouldn't be interrupted. King Edmund and Queen Isabella could see the seriousness in their daughter's expression and immediately cleared their schedules to hear what she had to say. The study's heavy oak doors were closed, and guards were instructed not to disturb them under any circumstances. Kathryn began by asking her parents to listen completely before asking questions or making judgments. She knew that what she was about to reveal would shock them deeply, and she needed their full attention to present all the evidence properly. The king and queen settled into their chairs, concerned by their daughter's grave tone and formal manner. Starting with her observations from weeks ago, Kathryn carefully detailed every incident she had witnessed or documented. She described Alexander's dramatic change in behavior, his weight loss, his fearfulness, and his complete loss of joy. She explained how Lady Larissa had isolated him from the caring palace staff and convinced him that the abuse was normal treatment for a royal child. The queen's face grew pale as Kathryn described the psychological torture Alexander had endured. Queen Isabella remembered her son's bright laughter and curious questions, qualities that had seemingly vanished over recent months. She had attributed the change to normal growing up, never imagining that someone entrusted with his care could be deliberately crushing his spirit. King Edmund's expression darkened with each detail of physical abuse Kathryn revealed. The idea that someone would dare lay harsh hands on his son, let alone someone he had specifically chosen to protect and educate the boy, filled him with a rage he struggled to control. His knuckles whitened as he gripped the arms of his chair, listening to how Lady Larissa had used Alexander's natural obedience and trust against him. When Kathryn played the recorded evidence, both parents listened in stunned silence to Lady Larissa's cruel words and Alexander's quiet sobs. The recordings captured the governess calling the young prince worthless, stupid, and a disappointment to his family. They heard her threatening him with punishments if he told anyone about their private lessons, and they heard their son's broken voice promising to try harder and be better. Queen Isabella broke down completely when she heard Alexander apologizing repeatedly for existing, for being a burden, for disappointing everyone he loved. The psychological damage was evident in every word the child spoke, and she realized how completely Lady Larissa had destroyed her son's self-worth in just a few months. Martha was called to give her testimony, and the loyal servant provided additional details that painted an even darker picture of Alexander's daily suffering. She described finding the young prince collapsed from exhaustion after being forced to stand for hours as punishment, and she revealed that Lady Larissa had been restricting his food as another form of control. The maid also shared that Alexander had been having frequent nightmares, often waking up screaming Lady Larissa's name. He had begun wetting the bed again, something he hadn't done since he was very young, clearly a response to the extreme stress he was under. Martha had been changing his sheets secretly, knowing that if the governess discovered this regression, she would use it to humiliate him further. King Edmund immediately summoned the captain of the royal guard and ordered Lady Larissa to be detained pending a full investigation. The governess was in Alexander's study when the guards arrived, and she initially tried to maintain her innocent facade, claiming that any allegations against her were ridiculous and unfounded. However, when confronted with the recorded evidence and multiple witness testimonies, Lady Larissa's composed mask finally slipped. Her true nature emerged as she angrily defended her methods, claiming that she was trying to make Alexander strong and worthy of his royal position. She showed no remorse for the pain she had caused, instead blaming the young prince for being weak and oversensitive. The governess's complete lack of empathy or understanding convinced the king and queen that she was genuinely dangerous and had never cared about Alexander's well-being. Her only concerns had been her own sense of power and control over a vulnerable child. Lady Larissa was immediately dismissed from her position and escorted from the palace under guard. Alexander was gently brought to his parents' study, where he initially cowered, expecting to be punished for something. The sight of their terrified son broke both the king's and queen's hearts completely. They spent hours reassuring him that he wasn't in trouble, that he was loved unconditionally, and that Lady Larissa would never hurt him again. The young prince's relief was overwhelming, and for the first time in months, he began to speak honestly about his experiences. Between tears, he told his parents about the constant fear he had lived with, never knowing what small mistake would trigger Lady Larissa's anger. He had believed her lies about bringing shame to the family and had been trying desperately to become perfect enough to earn love and acceptance. Princess Kathryn was praised by her parents for her courage and determination in protecting her brother. They recognized that without her careful investigation and brave decision to speak up, Alexander's suffering might have continued indefinitely. The princess was also commended for her mature handling of such a serious situation, gathering concrete evidence rather than making accusations she couldn't prove. The royal family arranged for Alexander to receive help from the kingdom's most skilled healers, both for his physical recovery and his emotional healing. A kind, gentle tutor was found to continue his education at a much more appropriate pace, focusing on rebuilding his confidence and love of learning rather than demanding perfection. Lady Larissa faced serious legal consequences for her abuse of the young prince. Word of her crimes spread quickly throughout noble circles, ensuring that she would never again be trusted with the care of any child. The king and queen also implemented new policies for monitoring their children's education and well-being, determined that such abuse would never happen again under their roof. Slowly, over many weeks, Alexander began to heal and recover his natural personality. His laughter returned gradually, starting as quiet giggles and eventually growing into the joyful sounds his family remembered. He gained back the weight he had lost, and the dark circles under his eyes faded as he learned to sleep peacefully again. The bond between Kathryn and Alexander grew even stronger through this experience. The young prince understood that his sister had saved him from a terrible situation, and he felt safe confiding in her about his fears and progress. Kathryn made sure to spend extra time with him each day, helping him remember how to play and have fun without fear of punishment. Months later, Alexander had recovered enough to speak publicly about his experience, hoping to help other children who might be facing similar abuse. His courage in sharing his story led to new laws protecting children throughout the kingdom and established better procedures for investigating concerns about caregivers. The young prince grew up to be a compassionate and strong leader, using his painful experience to help others and ensure that no child under his future protection would ever suffer as he had. Princess Kathryn's brave actions had not only saved her brother, but had created positive changes that would protect countless other children for generations to come.